October 12th, 1992. Kurt Cobain was driving through the rain-soaked streets of Seattle when he heard his own voice coming through the radio speakers and realized he didn't recognize himself anymore. The song was "Smells Like Teen Spirit," and it had just hit number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100. For most musicians, this would have been the moment of triumph. For Kurt, it was the moment he decided to quit music forever. What happened next in a small house in the Capitol Hill neighborhood would save not just his career, but change how an entire generation understood what it meant to be authentic. This is the story of how Kurt Cobain almost walked away from everything and how one accidental discovery brought him back to himself. The windshield wipers struggled against the October rain as Kurt's beat-up Volkswagen van crawled through downtown Seattle traffic. Kiss was playing the hits, and the DJ's voice cut through the static with barely contained excitement. That was Nirvana with "Smells Like Teen Spirit," the song that's been climbing the charts faster than anything we've seen from the underground scene. Kurt reached for the radio dial, but stopped. He needed to hear this. He needed to understand what was happening to his life. The song filled the cramped van, but it sounded alien to his ears. The production was clean, polished, radio-ready. The guitars had been compressed and EQ'd until they fit perfectly into the narrow frequency range that program directors preferred. His voice, which he'd always thought of as raw and vulnerable, had been processed until it sounded like every other alternative rock singer trying to break into mainstream radio. This wasn't the song he remembered writing in the basement of his apartment, fueled by frustration and cheap beer. That song had been angry, desperate, a scream against everything he saw wrong with the world. This radio version was that scream, but professionally packaged, focus grouped, and sanitized for mass consumption. The traffic light turned green, but Kurt didn't move. Behind him, car horns began to honk, but he barely heard them. He was too busy listening to what had become of his art. When the song ended, the DJ launched into a breathless commentary about how Nirvana was leading the grunge revolution, how they were bringing authentic rock back to the mainstream, how Kurt Cobain was the voice of his generation. Each word felt like a nail in a coffin Kurt hadn't realized was being built around him. By the time he pulled into the driveway of the small house he shared with his girlfriend, Toby Vale, Kurt had made a decision that felt as inevitable as the Seattle rain. He was done. The music industry had taken everything that mattered to him about creating art and turned it into a product, and he'd let them do it. Inside the house, the evidence of Nirvana's sudden success was everywhere, and it all felt wrong. Gold records that the label had sent as congratulations leaned against walls that had once displayed flyers for underground shows. Boxes of fan mail sat unopened in corners where his guitars used to rest. Phone messages from booking agents, journalists, and label executives covered every available surface. Kurt walked past all of it and went straight to his room, where he pulled out a notebook and began to write. Not lyrics, he was done with those, but a letter. A resignation from the music business, from the expectations, from the version of himself that had somehow become public property. "I never wanted to be a spokesperson," he wrote, his handwriting growing more agitated with each line. "I never wanted to represent a generation or a movement or anything bigger than just being honest about how fucked up everything feels most of the time." The words came quickly, fueled by months of building frustration that he'd never been able to articulate. The success of Nevermind had happened so fast that he'd never had time to process what it meant. One day he was playing to crowds of 50 people in dingy clubs, and the next he was being called the voice of Generation X by magazines he'd never heard of. But it wasn't just the fame that was eating at him. It was the way the music itself had changed in the translation from his heart to the radio. Every song on Nevermind had started as something personal, something that mattered to him deeply. But in the process of recording, mixing, and mastering, they'd been transformed into products designed to appeal to the widest possible audience. The irony wasn't lost on him that his songs about alienation and authenticity had become the soundtrack to suburban teenage rebellion. Kids who had never experienced real struggle were using his music to soundtrack their middle-class angst. His pain had become their fashion statement. As Kurt continued writing, the letter became less of a resignation and more of a confession. He wrote about how he'd started playing music because it was the only way he could make sense of the world, how creating songs had been like building a private language that only he understood. And now that language had been translated, interpreted, and broadcast to millions of people who thought they knew what it meant. The worst part was that he was starting to doubt his own motivations. Had he written Smells Like Teen Spirit because he genuinely felt those emotions, or because part of him had known it would be catchy? Was his anti-commercial stance authentic, or was it just another form of posturing designed to maintain his credibility with the underground scene that had created him? It was getting dark outside when Kurt finally set down his pen. The letter was 8 pages long, rambling but heartfelt, and it said everything he needed to say about why he couldn't continue being the person everyone expected him to be. He folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope addressed to his manager. But as he prepared to seal it, something caught his eye. Sitting on his desk underneath a pile of interview requests and concert reviews was a cassette tape labeled Home Demos, Summer '91. He'd forgotten about it completely, but seeing it now brought back memories of the sessions that had preceded the recording of Nevermind. Curiosity got the better of him. Before he could talk himself out of it, Kurt slipped the tape into his boombox and pressed play. What came through the speakers was his voice, but it was different from anything he'd heard in months. Raw, unprocessed, completely honest. These were the original versions of the songs that would later become Nevermind, recorded on a 4-track in his apartment with no thought of commercial appeal or radio play. The first song was an early version of Smells Like Teen Spirit, but it bore almost no resemblance to what he'd heard on the radio that afternoon. This version was slower, more deliberate, and infinitely more vulnerable. His voice cracked on certain words, not because of poor technique, but because the emotions were so intense that his vocal cords couldn't contain them. The guitar work was completely different too. Instead of the tight, compressed sound that had made the album version radio-friendly, this early take featured loose, feedback-heavy playing that prioritized feeling over precision. The mistakes weren't edited out. They were part of the song's DNA. As Kurt listened, he began to remember what it felt like to write these songs. The demo version captured something that had been lost in translation, the desperate honesty that had driven him to pick up a guitar in the first place. This wasn't music designed to represent anyone or anything. This was just one person trying to make sense of his place in the world. Track after track revealed the same pattern. The demo version wasn't trying to be anything other than exactly what it was. One person's attempt to transform pain into something meaningful. He thought about the letter he'd just written, about his decision to quit music, and suddenly it all seemed based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The problem wasn't that he'd sold out or compromised his artistic integrity. The problem was that he'd forgotten what his artistic integrity actually sounded like. Kurt rewound the tape and listened to the entire thing again, this time paying attention to the details he'd missed the first time through. The way his voice changed when he sang about subjects that really mattered to him. The guitar parts that prioritized emotional impact over technical proficiency. The overall sense that this music had been created for an audience of one, himself. By the third listen, Kurt began to understand something important. The version of himself that had been packaged and sold to the world wasn't the real him. It was just one possible interpretation of his work. But the real version still existed, captured on tapes like this one, waiting to be rediscovered. He started thinking about the musicians he'd always admired. Daniel Johnston, who recorded beautiful songs on a cheap boombox because that's all he had. The Shags, whose technical limitations had somehow resulted in music that was more emotionally honest than anything produced in professional studios. These artists had never worried about commercial appeal because they were too busy trying to capture something true. That's what was missing from his current approach to music. Somewhere in the process of making Nevermind, he'd started thinking about his audience instead of thinking about his art. He'd begun crafting songs rather than discovering them. And in doing so, he'd lost touch with the instinctive honesty that had made him want to make music in the first place. Kurt pulled out his guitar, not the expensive Fender that the label had bought him, but the beat-up Japanese Stratocaster knockoff he'd been playing since high school. He plugged it into the same small amplifier he'd used to record the demos, turned it up just enough to feel the strings vibrate against his fingers, and began to play. What came out of the amplifier wasn't a song exactly. It was more like a conversation between Kurt and his instrument, a rediscovery of the physical and emotional connection that had made him fall in love with music in the first place. His fingers found chord progressions he hadn't played in months, melodies that existed somewhere between major and minor, happy and sad, hopeful and desperate. As he played, Kurt began to sing, not words, just sounds that matched the emotional content of what his guitar was doing. It was the most natural thing in the world, like speaking in a language he'd temporarily forgotten but never really lost. The music that emerged from that late-night session was unlike anything on Nevermind. It was quieter but more intense, simpler but more complex, more personal but somehow more universal. It was the sound of an artist remembering why he'd started making art in the first place. Each song felt like a small revelation. One track captured the exact feeling of waking up at 3 a.m. with anxiety gnawing at his chest. Another translated the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who thought they knew you but didn't. A third managed to make depression sound almost beautiful, not by romanticizing it, but by acknowledging its weight without being crushed by it. Over the course of the next several hours, Kurt recorded more than 20 new songs, all of them direct to four-track, all of them in single takes, all of them completely honest. Some were angry, some were sad, some were weirdly hopeful, but all of them sounded like they could only have been made by one person, him. As the sun began to rise over Seattle, Kurt finally put down his guitar and looked at what he'd accomplished. The letter of resignation was still sitting on his desk, but it no longer seemed relevant. He hadn't solved the problem of commercial success versus artistic integrity, but he'd remembered something more important. His responsibility was to the music, not to the audience. When Toby came home the next morning, she found Kurt asleep at his desk, surrounded by cassette tapes and notebook pages covered with lyrics. The resignation letter was in the trash, torn into small pieces. In its place was a new letter, this one addressed to his bandmates Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic. "I want to make another record," the letter began, "but I want to make it the right way this time. I want to record it like we used to, before we started thinking about radio and sales and all that bullshit. I want to make music that sounds like us, not like what someone thinks we should sound like." The letter went on to describe his vision for what would eventually become In Utero, an album that would deliberately challenge the expectations created by Nevermind. It would be rawer, more aggressive, more uncompromising. It would prioritize artistic honesty over commercial appeal, even if that meant smaller sales and less radio play. But more importantly, it would represent a return to the principles that had guided Kurt's music from the beginning: authenticity, emotional honesty, and the belief that art should challenge rather than comfort its audience. The impact of that night extended far beyond Kurt's personal artistic journey. When In Utero was finally released, it showed other artists that commercial success didn't have to mean artistic compromise. It proved that audiences were hungry for authenticity, even when that authenticity was difficult or uncomfortable. The album's success, it debuted at #1 despite its deliberately uncommercial sound, sent a message throughout the music industry that artists didn't have to choose between integrity and popularity. They could have both, but only if they were willing to prioritize the former over the latter. Years later, when music journalists would ask Kurt about the period between Nevermind and In Utero, he would often refer to it as the time when he almost lost himself, but he would also describe it as essential to his development as an artist, because it forced him to rediscover what actually mattered to him about making music. The demo tapes from that October night were never officially released, but they became legendary among Nirvana fans who heard bootleg copies. They represented something that was often missing from popular music: the sound of an artist working through his ideas in real time, without concern for how those ideas would be received by others. More importantly, they documented the moment when Kurt Cobain chose to be an artist rather than a celebrity, to make music rather than products, to trust his instincts rather than market research. It was a choice that would define not just his career, but the entire alternative music movement that followed. The day Kurt Cobain almost quit music was the day he remembered why he'd started making music in the first place. And in that remembering, he didn't just save his own career, he showed an entire generation of artists that authenticity wasn't just possible in the music business, it was essential. Because sometimes the most important thing an artist can do is stop trying to be what everyone expects them to be and start being exactly who they truly are. even if that person is complicated, contradictory, and completely uncommercial in every single way. Especially then, that's when the real music truly begins here.